If you're not James, then please just ignore this. I'm sorry. I'm just out of time. The message sat there, glowing faintly against the cracked screen of Emily Carter's phone, her thumb hovering just a second too long before she hit send, as if some invisible part of her knew that one wrong digit could change everything. But exhaustion had already dulled her instincts and desperation had taken the wheel hours ago, maybe days ago if she was being honest, because time had stopped feeling normal the moment both of her babies started breathing too fast and too shallow at the same time, the kind of rhythm that no mother ever forgets once she hears it, the kind that turns every second into something heavy and urgent and terrifyingly quiet between each fragile inhale. The apartment smelled faintly of damp laundry and cheap formula, the single overhead bulb flickering every few minutes like it couldn't decide whether to stay or give up, and Emily sat cross-legged on the worn carpet between the two bassinets, one hand resting on each tiny chest, as if she could somehow steady their breathing just by being there, just by refusing to let go, her fingers trembling not from fear alone, but from the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones when sleep becomes a luxury you stopped affording weeks ago. Olivia stirred first, a soft whimper slipping past her lips, her tiny face flushed warmer than it should be, while Noah lay quieter, too quiet, his breaths light and uneven, and Emily swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in her eyes because she didn't have time for that. Not now. Not when everything inside her was screaming to fix this, to do something, anything. Even if all she had left was a phone with a dying battery and a contact saved under a name she trusted. James, her brother. The only person she thought might answer at this hour. The only one who might not ask questions she couldn't afford to answer. And yet somewhere between her shaking hands and the cracked keypad, one number slipped. Just one, so small it barely mattered, except it did. 3 miles away, 40 floors above a city that never really slept, Alexander Hayes glanced at his phone with the kind of casual detachment that came from years of filtering noise from necessity, expecting another update, another figure, another decision waiting to be made. But instead he found a message that didn't belong in his world, words that felt too raw, too unpolished to be part of the carefully managed life he had built around himself. And for a moment, just a moment, he considered ignoring it, letting it fade into the background like everything else that didn't directly demand his attention, because that was easier, because that was what people expected of someone in his position. But his eyes paused on a single word, then another, babies, twins, and something in his chest tightened in a way he didn't immediately understand. Emily's phone buzzed before she could second-guess herself, before she could spiral into regret or embarrassment or the familiar weight of being a burden, and her breath caught as she read the reply, short, direct, unfamiliar. I think you've got the wrong number. Heat rushed to her face despite the chill in the room, and she pressed her lips together, already typing back an apology, fingers moving too fast for her thoughts to keep up. I'm so sorry. Please ignore that. Wrong person. She almost dropped the phone after that, almost turned her attention back entirely to the quiet rhythm of her children's breathing, convincing herself that nothing had changed, that nothing would change, because it never really did, not for people like her. But then another message came through, faster this time, unexpected in a way that made her pause. Are they okay? She stared at the screen, confusion threading through her exhaustion, because strangers didn't ask that. Not really. Not without a reason, not without expecting something in return, and every instinct she had built over the past 2 years told her to shut it down, to protect what little she had left. But then Noah's breathing hitched again, just slightly, just enough to tilt her world off balance. And suddenly caution didn't feel as important as hope, no matter how small or misplaced it might be. They're sick, she typed, hesitating before adding more, because once you started explaining, you couldn't always stop, and vulnerability had a way of spreading faster than you intended, but the words came anyway, simple and unfiltered. I have twins. They've both got fevers. I don't have a car. I can't get them to the hospital right now. There was a pause on the other end, longer this time, long enough for doubt to creep back in, for her to wonder if she'd said too much, trusted too quickly. But across the city, Alexander Hayes was no longer looking at spreadsheets or contracts or the skyline that usually grounded him. He was reading and rereading a message that didn't belong to him, a situation he hadn't asked for, and yet couldn't quite ignore, because something about the way it was written, the lack of polish, the absence of performance, felt real in a way that his world rarely allowed. He leaned back slightly, phone still in hand, and typed before logic could fully catch up with instinct. Which one is worse? The question landed on Emily's screen with a quiet weight, precise and unexpected, and for the first time that night, her fears shifted into something else, something fragile but unmistakable, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't reached the wrong person after all. Emily's fingers froze above the screen for a fraction of a second as she read the question again, slower this time, as if the words might change meaning if she gave them enough attention. But they did not. They stayed steady and simple and strangely focused. Not who are you? Not why did you message me? Just which one is worse? And something about that made her chest tighten in a way that was not entirely fear. More like the fragile edge of relief she did not trust yet, her gaze flicking between the phone and the two tiny bodies beside her, Olivia's restless movements growing sharper, Noah still too still for comfort, and she swallowed hard before typing, her thumbs clumsy but determined. My son. Noah. His breathing is lighter. I think he is getting weaker. The reply came faster this time, almost immediate, as if he had been waiting with the phone in his hand, as if this mattered more than it should to a stranger. How long has he been like that? Emily pressed her lips together, trying to count through the haze in her mind, the hours blending into each other, the nights stretching endlessly around her. A few hours. Maybe more. I do not know. I tried to cool him down. I gave him what I had. She paused, then added, because honesty felt unavoidable now. I cannot get them to a hospital tonight. There was a silence again, but this one felt different, heavier, as though something on the other end had shifted, like a decision forming, and Emily's heart began to beat faster without knowing why, her instincts torn between caution and the quiet, growing sense that she had stepped into something she could not fully see yet. Across the city, Alexander Hayes stood from his chair without quite realizing he had made the decision to do so, the skyline behind him fading into irrelevance as he walked toward the glass wall, phone still in his hand, the message thread glowing against the dim reflection of his own expression, more focused than it had been all evening, because this was not part of the schedule, not part of the controlled, measured world he had built, and yet the details were aligning in a way he could not ignore. 2 infants, a mother alone, no transport, no delay left to negotiate, and his jaw tightened slightly as he typed, slower now, but deliberate. Send me your address. Emily stared at the message as if it might disappear, her breath catching in her throat, because that was not a normal response, not from anyone, let alone someone she did not know, and every warning she had ever heard echoed faintly in the back of her mind. Strangers do not help without a reason. Nothing is free. Be careful. But then Olivia let out a sharper cry, her small body twisting, and Noah's chest rose just a little too slowly, and the balance tipped, fear outweighing doubt in a single, irreversible moment, her fingers moving again, this time with urgency she did not try to hide. Unit 12, 3rd floor, Lawson Street, Parramatta. She hesitated after sending it, her eyes fixed on the door of the small apartment, as if expecting something immediate, something impossible, but nothing changed. The hallway outside remained quiet, the flickering light above her continued its uneven rhythm, and for a second, she almost laughed at herself, because what did she expect? That help would arrive instantly, that a stranger would somehow appear out of nowhere. But then her phone buzzed again, the vibration sharper this time against her palm. Stay with them. Keep them warm. Do not fall asleep. Her breath hitched again, confusion mixing with something dangerously close to hope. What are you doing? She typed back, her hands shaking more now. Because if this was not nothing, then it was something far bigger than she understood, and the response came with a clarity that cut through the noise in her mind. I am coming. Emily blinked at the words, once, twice, as if her eyes needed to confirm what her brain could not quite accept, her gaze drifting to the window without thinking. The dark street below empty except for a single parked car and the faint glow of a distant streetlight. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, and yet her pulse would not slow, because something had shifted, something real, something approaching, even if she could not see it yet. High above, the sound began as a distant hum, almost lost beneath the quiet of the night, a low vibration that seemed to roll through the air before it could be heard clearly, and Emily frowned slightly, her head tilting as she tried to place it, because it did not belong to the usual sounds of the neighborhood, not the occasional passing car, not the distant train, something deeper, louder, growing steadily, and her heart began to race again. Not from fear this time, but from the unfamiliar weight of anticipation, her eyes lifting toward the window as the sound intensified, filling the space around her. And for the first time in hours, she felt something other than helplessness, something fragile and uncertain, but undeniably present. The feeling that maybe help was no longer just a word on a screen. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was already on its way. The sound grew louder, no longer something distant or imagined, but a deep, steady thrum that pressed against the thin glass of the window and vibrated faintly through the floor beneath Emily's knees, and she turned her head fully. Now, her breath catching as she tried to understand what she was hearing, because helicopters did not come to Lawson Street. Not at this hour, not ever, and certainly not for people like her. Yet the noise continued to build, slicing through the quiet night with an authority that made everything else feel small, and Olivia's crying shifted, not stopping but changing, as if even the baby sensed something different in the air, while Noah's chest rose and fell in that fragile rhythm that had not improved, and Emily's heart pounded harder, her thoughts racing ahead of logic, because there was only one explanation she could not quite accept yet. Her phone buzzed again in her hand, and she looked down quickly, almost afraid of what it might say, but the message was simple, grounded, real. You will hear us before you see us. Do not panic. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry, her eyes lifting back to the window as the sound intensified, now unmistakable, the chopping rhythm of rotor blades cutting through the night air, and a flicker of light swept across the buildings opposite her unit, brief and searching, then gone, then back again, brighter this time, deliberate, and her pulse jumped, because this was no coincidence, no passing aircraft heading somewhere else. This was stopping, hovering, coming closer. Outside, a few lights flicked on in neighboring units, curtains shifting as people looked out into the night, drawn by the noise that did not belong, and Emily pushed herself to her feet slowly, careful not to jostle the bassinets, her legs unsteady from hours on the floor, but moving anyway, pulled toward the window as if she needed to see it to believe it, and when she reached it, her hand trembled as she pulled the curtain aside just enough to look. The street below was no longer empty, shadows moving as neighbors stepped out onto balconies or into the narrow footpath, their faces turned upward, illuminated by the sweeping beam of a searchlight that now clearly came from above. And then she saw it, the dark silhouette of a helicopter hovering low over the block, its presence both powerful and surreal, the downdraft stirring loose papers and dust along the street. And Emily's breath caught so sharply it almost hurt, because there was no denying it anymore. This was for her, for them, for two tiny lives she had been afraid were slipping away just minutes ago. Her phone vibrated again, grounding her just enough to pull her back from the edge of disbelief. We cannot land on the street. Is there access to the roof? She stared at the message, her mind scrambling to process it. Roof access. Of course there was, a narrow stairwell at the end of the corridor, rarely used, barely maintained, but it was there, and suddenly everything felt urgent again, sharper, faster, because help was not just coming. It was here, waiting, and she could not freeze now. She could not hesitate. Yes, there is a roof, she typed quickly, her fingers moving with a clarity that cut through the exhaustion. I can get there. The reply came instantly. Wrap them well. Hold them close. Someone will meet you upstairs. Emily did not question it, did not ask who or how or why, because there was no time left for doubt, only action, and she moved quickly now, her body responding to something deeper than fear, a fierce, focused determination that had carried her through every hard day since the twins were born, and she grabbed the only thick blanket she had, wrapping it carefully around both Olivia and Noah, tucking it close to their small bodies, her hands gentle but efficient, her movements practiced in a way that spoke of countless nights spent doing everything alone. Olivia whimpered softly as she was lifted, her small fingers curling instinctively against Emily's shirt, while Noah remained quiet, his warmth faint against her chest, and that alone pushed her forward faster, her heart tightening with every second that passed, because now there was something she could do, somewhere she could go, and she refused to waste a single moment of it. The hallway outside her unit was dim and narrow, the flickering light casting uneven shadows as she stepped out, holding both babies close, her steps careful but quick, the distant roar of the helicopter echoing through the building in a way that made every footstep feel louder, more urgent, and at the far end of the corridor, the metal door to the stairwell stood slightly ajar, as if someone had already passed through, as if the path had been opened just for her. She pushed it wider with her shoulder, the cool air rushing in as she stepped inside, the concrete stairs spiraling upward, each level marked by a faint echo of her own movement, and she climbed, one step at a time, her breath uneven but steady, her focus fixed on the top, because somewhere above her, beyond the worn walls and the dim light, was something she had not expected to find tonight, something she had almost given up on entirely, a chance, fragile and unexpected, but real. And as she reached the final landing, the door to the roof already open, the wind hitting her face before she even stepped through, she tightened her hold on her children and moved forward into the light. The wind hit her the moment she stepped onto the rooftop, sharp and loud and alive, whipping strands of her hair across her face as the helicopter hovered just meters above, its blades cutting through the night with a force that made the loose gravel skitter across the concrete. And Emily instinctively tightened her hold on the twins, pressing them closer to her chest, as if her body alone could shield them from the intensity of it all, her heart pounding not from fear anymore, but from something far more overwhelming. The realization that this was real, that someone had actually come for them, that she was no longer alone in this moment she had been silently dreading for hours. A figure moved toward her through the shifting light, steady and purposeful despite the wind, dressed in dark clothing with a reflective vest catching the beam from above, and he raised a hand to signal her, his voice firm but calm as it reached her through the noise. "Emily?" She nodded quickly, unable to trust her voice, and he stepped closer, his movements careful as his eyes dropped to the bundled shapes in her arms, assessing without hesitation. "We need to move quickly. You will come with me. Keep them close." She did not question him, not now, not when every instinct told her this was the help she had been praying for without words, and she followed. As he guided her toward the center of the rooftop where the helicopter hovered low enough to approach, its door already open, a second person inside reaching out to steady her as she stepped forward, her legs unsteady but moving anyway, because stopping was no longer an option. The moment she crossed into the aircraft, the noise shifted, still loud but contained, the interior lit with a soft, focused glow that felt almost surreal compared to the dim, flickering light she had left behind, and the door slid shut behind her with a solid finality that made her chest tighten again, not in fear this time, but in something closer to relief, because this was movement, this was action, this was a chance. "Sit here," the man inside said, guiding her gently to a seat, his tone professional but not cold, and she lowered herself carefully, still holding both babies close, her eyes flicking between their small faces as if she needed constant reassurance that they were still there, still breathing, still fighting. "We have got you," he added, quieter now, and she nodded, swallowing hard as her gaze lifted for the first time to take in the space around her, and that was when she saw him. Alexander Hayes did not look like the kind of man who should be here, not in a helicopter hovering above a quiet suburban street in the middle of the night, not in a moment this raw and unfiltered, and yet there he was, seated across from her, his presence steady, his attention entirely focused on her and the two tiny lives in her arms. His expression calm but intent in a way that made everything else fade into the background. For a second, Emily forgot how to breathe, her mind struggling to reconcile the reality in front of her with the voice that had been on the other end of her phone just minutes ago, because this was not just someone who had sent help. This was someone who had come himself, and that realization settled heavily in her chest. "Emily," he said, his voice exactly as she remembered, grounded and controlled, but carrying something softer beneath it, something she could not quite name, and she nodded again, her grip tightening unconsciously around the blanket. "Yes." His eyes moved, briefly to the twins, assessing, calculating, but not distant, never distant. And when he looked back at her, there was no hesitation in his tone. We will get them to a hospital within minutes. She let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her shoulders dropping slightly as the words sank in, because minutes felt like everything right now. Minutes felt like the difference between fear and hope, between losing and holding on. The helicopter lifted higher then, the subtle shift in motion barely noticeable at first, but enough to make the city lights below begin to stretch and scatter, and Emily glanced out the window instinctively, watching as Lawson Street became smaller, quieter, the place where she had felt trapped just moments ago now fading into the distance, and something inside her shifted with it, a quiet release of the weight she had been carrying alone for far too long. "Why did you help me?" she asked before she could stop herself, her voice softer now, but steady enough to carry the question that had been building since the first reply appeared on her screen. And for a moment, Alexander did not answer, his gaze dropping briefly to Noah, then to Olivia, as if measuring something deeper than the situation itself, something tied to memory rather than logic. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, less guarded. "Because you asked for help," he said simply, and though the answer sounded straightforward, there was something beneath it, something unspoken that lingered in the space between them, something that suggested this was not just about a message sent to the wrong number, not just about a moment of chance, but something else entirely, something neither of them fully understood yet. Emily looked down at her children again, her fingers brushing lightly over their blankets, feeling the faint warmth that reassured her they were still here, still fighting. And for the first time that night, her eyes filled with tears she did not try to hold back, not because she was breaking, but because she was no longer holding everything together alone. And as the helicopter cut through the night toward a destination she had not been able to reach on her own, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that maybe this was not just survival anymore. Maybe this was something more, something that had started with a mistake, but was becoming something she could not yet name. The helicopter banked slightly as it cut across the sleeping city, the distant glow of streetlights stretching into long ribbons beneath them. And Emily felt the shift not just in the aircraft, but somewhere deeper in her chest. A fragile sense of movement towards something safer, something she had not dared to expect, while the steady hum around her created a strange cocoon where time seemed suspended between fear and relief. And she kept her eyes on the twins, watching every small rise and fall of their chests as if her attention alone could anchor them here. Olivia's breathing still uneven but stronger than before, Noah's softer, quieter, yet present, and she leaned closer, her cheek brushing lightly against the blanket, whispering words she did not even realize she was saying. Just small reassurances, just something to fill the silence that had terrified her only minutes ago. Across from her, Alexander remained still but alert, his gaze shifting between the children and Emily with a focus that did not waver, as if every detail mattered, as if he was committing this moment to memory for reasons even he did not fully understand. And there was something in the way he watched, not intrusive, not detached, but attentive in a way that felt unfamiliar to her, because people usually looked past her situation, past the quiet struggle she carried every day, but he did not. He saw it, all of it, and did not turn away. One of the medical crew leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and steady as he checked the babies with practiced care, adjusting the blanket just enough to monitor their temperature, his movements efficient but gentle. "We are about 8 minutes out," he said, glancing toward Alexander briefly before returning his attention to the twins. "They will have a full team ready." Emily nodded quickly, even though the information took a second to settle in her mind. 8 minutes, such a small amount of time, and yet it felt like everything, because she had already spent hours in uncertainty, hours where nothing changed, and now every second seemed to carry them closer to something that might make a difference. She shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting her hold as Olivia stirred again, a soft sound escaping her lips, and Emily instinctively soothed her with a gentle movement, her hand moving in slow circles across the blanket. The same motion she had used countless times before, the same quiet rhythm that had become second nature, and for a moment, she forgot where she was, forgot the helicopter, the noise, the man across from her. And it was just her and her children again, just the familiar bond that had carried her through every uncertain day. You are doing well, Alexander said quietly, the words cutting through her thoughts with a softness that surprised her, and she looked up, caught off guard not by the compliment itself, but by the sincerity behind it, because it did not feel like something said out of obligation or politeness. It felt observed, understood in a way that made her chest tighten again, and she shook her head slightly, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. I am just trying to keep them here. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, as if that answer was enough, as if it explained more than she had intended to share. The city lights grew brighter beneath them as they approached the hospital, a larger building standing out against the quieter streets, its rooftop illuminated clearly, marked for landing, and the helicopter began to descend, the motion steady but noticeable, and Emily felt her grip tighten again, not from fear this time, but from anticipation, because this was the moment everything had been leading to, the point where uncertainty would either break or shift into something else entirely. The landing was smoother than she expected, the aircraft settling with a controlled firmness, and before she could fully process it, the door was already opening, cool night air rushing in as the medical team moved with quiet urgency, one of them reaching for the twins with careful hands. We will take them now, he said gently, waiting just long enough for her to nod before guiding them from her arms. And that moment, that brief separation, made her heart lurch in a way she had not prepared for. Because even though she knew it was necessary, even though she understood this was what she had wanted, letting go, even for a second, felt like stepping into something uncertain again. I am right here. Alexander's voice came beside her, steady and close, grounding her just enough to keep her moving as she followed them out onto the rooftop. Her steps quick despite the lingering fatigue, her eyes fixed on the small forms being carried ahead of her, and everything else faded into the background. The noise, the lights, the unfamiliar surroundings, because there was only one thing that mattered now, staying close, staying present, not losing sight of them even for a moment. Inside, the hospital lights were brighter, cleaner, everything moving faster, but with a structure she could not have created on her own, voices calm but efficient, guiding, directing, and Emily stayed close, her gaze never leaving the twins as they were taken further in, her breath shallow but steady, because she had made it this far, they had made it this far, and for the first time since the night began, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were not too late. The doors swung open with a quiet urgency that did not feel chaotic but precise, as if every person in that corridor already knew exactly what needed to be done before Emily could even catch her breath, and she followed closely, her eyes locked on the small forms of Olivia and Noah, as they were guided through the bright hallway, the fluorescent lights reflecting softly off clean floors and pale walls, everything so different from the dim, uncertain space she had left behind that it almost felt unreal, like stepping into a place where things worked the way they were supposed to, where help arrived on time, where people did not hesitate. A nurse moved beside her, speaking gently but clearly, asking questions that Emily answered as best as she could, her voice uneven but steady enough to carry the details that mattered, how long the fevers had lasted, what she had given them, when their breathing had changed, each answer pulling her deeper into the moment, anchoring her in something practical, something she could still control even as everything else moved so quickly around her. They turned a corner, and then another, until the twins were taken through a set of double doors, and Emily stopped instinctively, her body refusing to move forward without them, her hands empty now in a way that felt unfamiliar and unsettling, as if she had misplaced something essential, something she had not been without since the day they were born. They will take care of them, a voice said beside her, steady and calm, and she turned slightly to see Alexander still there, not behind her, not distant, but exactly where he had been since the moment she stepped into the helicopter, present in a way that made everything feel just a little less overwhelming, and she nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the closed doors, as if she could see through them if she tried hard enough. The seconds stretched, longer than they should have, or maybe shorter, she could not tell anymore, because time felt different here, measured not by clocks but by breath, by waiting, by the quiet hope that something inside those rooms was shifting in the right direction. A doctor approached after what felt like both a moment and an eternity, his expression composed but not distant, the kind of calm that came from experience, and he spoke directly to her, explaining in clear, careful words that both children were being assessed, that they were responding, that they had arrived in time. And those last words settled into her chest with a weight she did not expect, because she had not realized how much she needed to hear them until that very second. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping as the tension she had been holding for hours began to loosen just enough to let her stand without feeling like she might collapse, and she pressed her lips together, nodding as she absorbed every word, every detail, holding on to them as if they were something solid she could keep. "Can I see them?" she asked, her voice softer now but steady, and the doctor gave a small nod, explaining that it would take a little time, that they needed to stabilize them first, that she would be brought in as soon as possible, and she accepted that, not because she wanted to wait, but because she understood now that waiting meant they were still fighting, still being cared for, still here. The corridor grew quieter after that, the initial rush settling into a steady rhythm, and Emily found herself sitting without remembering how she got there, her hands resting in her lap, still curled slightly, as if they expected to be holding something, and she stared at them for a moment, noticing the faint tremor that had not fully faded, the mark where the blanket had pressed into her skin, small details that grounded her in the reality of what had just happened. Across from her, Alexander remained standing for a moment before taking a seat nearby, not too close, not distant either, his presence measured, respectful, and she glanced up at him, really seeing him now in the stillness, not just as the voice from her phone or the man in the helicopter, but as someone who had stepped into her world without hesitation, someone who had chosen to stay. "You did not have to come yourself," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than she intended, because they held not just the observation but the question behind it, the why that had been building since the first message, and he met her gaze without looking away, his expression calm but thoughtful, as if he had already considered that question and had not yet decided how to answer it. "I wanted to be sure," he said after a moment. And though the words were simple, there was something in the way he said them that made them feel complete, as if they did not need anything more to be understood. Emily nodded slowly, her gaze drifting back toward the doors where the twins had been taken, and for the first time since the night began, the silence around her did not feel empty or threatening. It felt like a pause, like the space between something difficult and something better, and she leaned back slightly, allowing herself to rest just enough to keep going. Because she knew this was not the end of the night, not yet. But it was no longer the same night she had started in, and that alone was enough to hold on to. The minutes stretched in a way that felt heavier than the hours before, the kind of waiting that pressed quietly against Emily's chest, not loud or chaotic but persistent, as if every second carried weight now that she was no longer moving, no longer doing, just sitting with her hands folded together and her eyes fixed on the same set of doors, her body still adjusting to the absence of the twins in her arms, a space that felt too light, too empty, even though she knew they were just beyond it, being cared for, being watched, being helped in ways she could not provide on her own. The hospital around her moved in a rhythm that was steady and controlled, nurses passing with quiet efficiency, distant voices blending into a soft hum that did not intrude but reminded her that life continued here, that this place was built for moments like hers, moments where everything balanced on something unseen, something fragile but not beyond reach. She drew a slow breath, her fingers tightening slightly together, and for the first time since she had sat down, she leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on her knees, her posture no longer held rigid by urgency, but by something softer, something that allowed her to feel the exhaustion she had been holding back, the weight of the night settling into her shoulders in a way that made her blink slowly, as if her body was finally asking for rest now that it sensed she was no longer alone in carrying everything. "You should try to breathe," Alexander said quietly, his voice cutting gently through the silence beside her, not commanding, not distant, just present, and she turned her head slightly, surprised by how steady he still seemed, as if the chaos of the last hour had not unsettled him in the same way, though something in his eyes suggested he had not been untouched by it either. "I am breathing," she replied softly, though the faint curve of her lips suggested she understood what he meant, that her breaths had been shallow, uneven, guided more by tension than by rhythm, and she inhaled again, deeper this time, letting it out slowly, as if relearning something simple she had forgotten. He gave a small nod, not pressing further, and for a moment they sat in a silence that did not feel uncomfortable, not heavy, just shared, the kind that existed when words were no longer necessary to fill the space between two people who had just crossed something unexpected together. Emily's gaze drifted back to the doors, but her thoughts moved differently now, less frantic, less scattered, beginning to piece together the events that had brought her here, the message, the reply, the decision to trust, the sound of the helicopter cutting through the night, each moment threading into the next in a way that felt almost unreal when she looked at it as a whole, because none of it had been planned. None of it had been something she could have imagined even hours ago. "I nearly did not send that message," she said after a while, her voice thoughtful now, quieter, as if she was speaking more to the moment than to him. And he glanced at her, his attention shifting back from the corridor to her face, waiting, not interrupting. "I checked the number twice," she continued, a faint shake of her head following the words. "I thought something fell off, but I was too tired to fix it." She let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, more like a release of disbelief. "I almost corrected it." Alexander watched her for a second longer, his expression unreadable but attentive, and when he spoke, his tone was steady, measured in a way that suggested he had considered the same sequence of events from his side. "And if you had?" he asked quietly. Emily's gaze lowered slightly, her hands unclasping for a moment before she folded them again, the movement small but reflective, and she took a second before answering. "Then I would still be there," she said, her voice softer now, carrying the weight of what that would have meant, the long night stretching on without change, without help, without this moment, and she swallowed lightly, her throat tightening at the thought she did not finish aloud. Alexander leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze shifting forward again as if absorbing that answer in a way that went beyond the words themselves, and for a moment, he did not respond, not because there was nothing to say, but because what she had said settled into something deeper than conversation, something that lingered in the quiet space between them. A nurse passed by, offering a brief, reassuring glance, and Emily returned it automatically, her body beginning to recognize the patterns here, the calm, the order, the quiet confidence that came from people who knew what they were doing, and it grounded her further, pulling her away from the edge of what could have been and back into what was, into the present where her children were being cared for just beyond the doors. She continued to watch. "You trusted a stranger," Alexander said after a moment, his tone not questioning, not critical, just stating something that had already happened, and Emily looked at him again, her expression shifting slightly as she considered that, because it was true, she had, in a way she normally would not, in a way that went against every instinct she had learned to rely on. "No," she said quietly, the word gentle but certain, and he raised his eyes to meet hers, a flicker of curiosity passing through his otherwise composed expression. "I trusted the way you asked," she added, her voice steady now, clearer than before, as if she had found the exact thought she needed to express. "Most people would have asked who I was, or why I needed help, or if I could pay them back." She paused briefly, her gaze holding his. "You asked which one was worse." The words settled between them, simple but precise, and for the first time since they had met, something shifted visibly in Alexander's expression, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to see that what she had said mattered, that it reached something beyond the surface of who he was supposed to be, and he held her gaze for a moment longer before looking away, his jaw tightening slightly, as if containing a response he had not yet chosen to speak. The silence that followed was not empty, not uncertain. It was full of something quieter, something that did not need to be named, and Emily leaned back slowly in her seat, her body easing into the stillness in a way it had not allowed before, because for the first time since the night began, she was not waiting alone, and that changed everything in a way she was only just beginning to understand. The quiet stretched just long enough to feel fragile before it shifted, the sound of footsteps approaching from down the corridor pulling Emily's attention back to the present with a sudden sharpness, her head lifting instinctively, her body straightening as if it already knew before her mind could catch up, and she rose to her feet without thinking, her hands pressing lightly against the edge of the chair for balance, her heart beginning to race again. not with the same helpless fear as before, but with something tighter, more focused, the kind of anticipation that made every second feel heavier as the doctor from earlier stepped into view, his expression composed but no longer distant, his eyes finding hers immediately in a way that made everything else fall away. "They are stable," he said, his voice clear and steady, and the words landed in her chest with a force that made her breath catch. Because stable was not just a word, it was a shift. It was a line crossed from uncertainty into something that could hold, and she exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping as the tension that had been coiled inside her for hours began to unwind in a way that left her almost unsteady, her hand lifting briefly to her chest, as if to steady the feeling that threatened to overwhelm her. "They are responding well to treatment," the doctor continued, offering just enough detail to ground the moment, to make it real, and Emily nodded quickly, her eyes already filling again, not with panic this time, but with something softer, something that felt like relief breaking through after being held back for too long. "Can I see them now?" she asked, her voice quiet but urgent in its own way, and the doctor gave a small, reassuring nod, gesturing gently for her to follow, and she moved immediately, her steps quick but careful, as if she was afraid that moving too fast might somehow disrupt the fragile balance that had just been restored. The hallway felt different now, not because it had changed, but because she had the same lights, the same quiet movement around her, but her perception shifted, sharper, more present, and she followed closely, her focus narrowing to the single path ahead, to the room where her children were waiting, where she would finally see for herself that they were still here, still breathing, still hers. The door opened softly, and she stepped inside, her breath catching again as her eyes found them, smaller now against the hospital beds, monitors quietly tracking their progress, soft beeping sounds filling the space in a rhythm that was steady and reassuring, and she moved closer without hesitation, her hands lifting instinctively, hovering just above them before she let herself touch, gentle, careful, her fingers brushing against their blankets, feeling the warmth she had been afraid to lose. Olivia stirred slightly, her small face calmer now, her breathing more even, and Noah's chest rose and fell in a rhythm that, while still delicate, was stronger than before, and Emily let out a quiet breath that trembled at the edges, her eyes closing for just a second as the reality settled in fully. They were here, they were safe, they had made it through the part she could not control. "They are fighters," a nurse said softly from the side, her tone warm but professional, and Emily nodded without looking away, because she already knew that. She had seen it in every small breath they had taken through the night, every moment they had held on when it would have been easier to slip away, and she leaned slightly closer, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke to them, not expecting a response but needing to say it anyway. "I am here." Behind her, the quiet presence of Alexander remained, not intruding, not stepping forward unless needed, and when Emily finally turned, her expression had changed, not dramatically but enough to show the shift from survival to something steadier, something that could hold gratitude without breaking under it. "They are going to be okay," she said softly, the words both a statement and a confirmation, and he nodded once, his gaze moving briefly to the twins before returning to her. His expression calm, but carrying a weight she was beginning to recognize as something deeper than the situation itself. "Yes," he replied simply, and the certainty in his voice did not feel assumed. It felt grounded, as if he had already made sure of it in ways she did not yet understand. Emily glanced back at the twins, then at him again. The question that had been building shifting slightly now, no longer just why he helped, but how far that help extended. Because this was not a small thing. This was not something easily done or easily explained, and yet he stood there as if it had been the most natural decision in the world. "I do not know how to thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady but sincere, and for a moment, he did not respond, his gaze lowering slightly as if considering the words before choosing how to meet them, and when he spoke, his tone was softer than before, less guarded. "You do not need to," he said, and though the answer seemed simple, there was something in the way he said it that suggested it was not just politeness. It was something he believed, something that carried its own reason. Beneath the surface, Emily studied him for a second longer, as if trying to understand that reason, but the moment shifted again as a nurse stepped forward to explain the next steps. The the care they would receive, the monitoring that would continue through the night. And Emily listened carefully, absorbing each detail, grounding herself further in the reality that had replaced the fear, the structure that would carry them through the rest of the night. And as she stood there, her hand resting lightly against the edge of Noah's blanket, Olivia's small fingers curling faintly nearby, she realized something she had not allowed herself to consider before, that the message she had almost not sent had not just brought help. It had changed the direction of everything in a way she could not yet fully see. And as she glanced once more toward Alexander, still standing quietly at the edge of the room, she understood that whatever this was, it was not finished yet. The room settled into a quieter rhythm after the initial rush, the soft beeping of the monitors, blending into the background like a steady reassurance that everything was holding. Everything was continuing the way it should, and Emily remained close, her presence anchored beside the twins as if stepping away, even for a moment, might somehow undo the fragile progress they had made, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the cot, not gripping, not tense, just there. A constant point of contact that grounded her in the reality that this was no longer a moment of fear, but one of recovery. Olivia shifted again, her small movements slower now, less strained, and Emily leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke softly, not expecting a response, but knowing somehow that the words mattered, that they carried something beyond sound, something that connected in a way that went deeper than explanation. Noah's breathing followed a steadier pattern too, still delicate but no longer uneven in the way that had made her chest tighten earlier, and she watched him closely, her eyes tracing each rise and fall with a quiet intensity that spoke of hours spent doing exactly that, learning every subtle change, every signal that something was right or wrong. And for the first time since the night began, those signals felt reassuring rather than alarming. Behind her, the room remained calm, the medical staff moving in and out with quiet efficiency, checking monitors, adjusting small details, their presence steady and unobtrusive, and Emily found herself trusting that rhythm now, trusting that she no longer had to carry every decision alone, that there were others here who knew what to do, who would not hesitate when it mattered. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just enough to allow the exhaustion she had been holding back to surface, not overwhelming her, but settling into her in a way that felt almost gentle compared to the tension that had come before, and she closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, allowing herself to feel it without resistance. When she opened them again, she became aware of the quiet presence behind her, and she turned slightly, her gaze finding Alexander where he stood near the doorway, not intruding, not distant, simply observing in a way that felt respectful of the space while still remaining part of it. And she studied him for a moment, seeing now what she had not fully noticed before, the subtle tension in his posture, the way his attention never fully drifted, as if he was still measuring the situation, still ensuring that everything was unfolding as it should. "You can come closer," she said softly, the words offered without hesitation, because this moment, this space, no longer felt like something she needed to guard, and he paused for just a fraction of a second before stepping forward, his movements quiet, controlled, stopping at a respectful distance beside her as his gaze moved to the twins, taking in the same details she had been watching so closely. "They look stronger," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful, and she nodded, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time that night, not forced, not fleeting, but real in a way that surprised her as much as it did him. "They are," she replied, her tone carrying a quiet certainty now, and the shift in her voice did not go unnoticed, because it was no longer shaped by fear, but by something steadier, something grounded in what she could now see for herself. For a moment, they stood in silence, both watching, both present, the connection between them no longer defined by urgency, but by something quieter, something that had formed in the space between what had happened and what was still unfolding, and Emily felt it, that subtle change, the way the situation had moved beyond a single act of help into something that lingered, something that carried meaning beyond the moment itself. "Do you always respond like that?" she asked after a while, her voice thoughtful, not accusing, not overly curious, just trying to understand the person who had stepped into her life so suddenly. And he glanced at her briefly, the question settling before he answered. "No," he said simply, and though the word was short, it carried a weight that suggested it was not an easy answer, not something given lightly. And she tilted her head slightly, considering that, her gaze returning to the twins, before shifting back to him. Then why this time? She asked, not pressing, just allowing the question to exist between them. And he looked at the twins again, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly, something softer passing through it before it settled back into calm. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, less controlled, more honest in a way that felt unfiltered. Because you did not ask for much, he said, his eyes lingering on Noah for a moment longer. You asked for just enough. Emily frowned slightly, not in confusion but in thought, the words settling into her mind as she tried to understand them, and she looked down at her children again, her fingers brushing lightly against the blanket as if grounding herself in the reality that had come from that simple message, that small request she had almost not sent, and she let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing further as the meaning began to take shape. I did not think anyone would answer, she admitted quietly, her voice softer now, reflective, and he nodded once, as if that matched something he had already considered, something he had seen in the way she had written, the way she had asked. Most people would not have, he said, not dismissively, not harshly, just as a fact, and the honesty of it did not feel cold, it felt real, and she accepted it with a small nod of her own, because she knew it was true. She had lived that truth more times than she could count. The silence that followed was not empty, not uncertain. It was filled with the quiet understanding that had formed between them, something built not on words alone but on actions, on choices made in a moment where neither of them had known what would come next. And Emily found herself looking at him again, not with the guarded caution she had carried before, but with a clearer curiosity, a sense that whatever this was, whatever had started tonight, it was not something that would simply end. When the morning came, and as she stood there, her hand resting lightly near Noah, Olivia's breathing steady beside him, she realized that the night had not just changed their situation. It had changed something else too, something less visible, but just as real, something that was only beginning to unfold. The night began to soften around them in a way that was almost unnoticeable at first, the harsh urgency that had carried Emily through every second slowly easing into something steadier, something quieter, and as she stood beside the twins, her gaze moving between their small, resting faces and the gentle rhythm of the monitors, she realized that the fear had not disappeared entirely. It had simply changed shape, no longer sharp and overwhelming but distant, manageable, something she could hold, without it consuming her, and that alone felt like a kind of relief she had not expected to feel so soon. Olivia shifted slightly, her tiny fingers curling again beneath the blanket, and Emily leaned closer instinctively, her hand hovering just above before resting lightly against the fabric, grounding herself in the warmth, the presence, the undeniable proof that they were still here, and she let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering as the last of the tension released in small, quiet waves. Across the room, Alexander remained where he was, not moving much, not interrupting, simply watching in a way that had become familiar over the past hour, his presence steady and deliberate, and Emily found herself aware of it even when she was not looking directly at him, as if something about the way he held himself made it impossible to forget that he was there, that this had not been something he had done and left behind, but something he had stayed for, something he had chosen to see, through to the end. A nurse approached gently, her voice soft but clear as she explained that the twins would need to remain under observation for a while, that their progress was promising but required careful monitoring. And Emily listened closely, nodding at each detail, her mind absorbing the information not with panic but with focus, because now she could understand it. Now she had space to process, and when the nurse finished, she asked the question that had already begun forming. Can I stay with them? The answer came without hesitation, a reassuring nod, a simple confirmation that she could remain nearby, that she would not be asked to leave. And Emily felt something inside her settle further, a quiet certainty that she would not be separated from them again tonight. She glanced toward Alexander then, the shift in her expression subtle but clear, gratitude no longer mixed with uncertainty but standing on its own, and she took a small step closer to him, her voice low but steady as she spoke. I do not think I would have made it here without you. The words were simple, but they carried everything she could not fully express. Every moment from the first message to now, and he met her gaze, his expression calm but thoughtful, as if he understood the weight of what she was saying without needing it to be explained further. "You did," he replied after a moment, his tone measured but not dismissive. "You chose to keep going." She shook her head slightly, a faint smile touching her lips as she glanced back at the twins. "I almost stopped," she admitted quietly, and the honesty of it lingered in the space between them. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real. And he did not interrupt, did not try to correct it. He simply let it exist, acknowledging it with a small nod that felt more meaningful than words. The room remained calm, the steady rhythm of care continuing around them, and Emily moved back toward the twins, her hand resting lightly near Noah again, her presence now less urgent, more settled, and she felt it then, the shift that had been building since the moment she stepped into the hospital, the realization that this night, as overwhelming as it had been, was no longer something she was surviving. It was something she was moving through, something that was carrying her toward a place she had not expected to reach. "What happens now?" she asked softly after a while, not looking away from the twins as she spoke. The question not just about the next few hours, but about everything beyond it, everything that came after the immediate crisis had passed, and Alexander took a moment before answering, his gaze following hers, resting on the twins, on the small, steady signs of recovery that filled the space. "Now they rest," he said, his voice quiet but certain, "and you do the same." Emily let out a small breath, the suggestion simple but almost unfamiliar, because rest had not been something she allowed herself easily. Not when there was always something else to manage, something else to worry about. But tonight was different. Tonight had already shifted in ways she could not ignore, and she nodded slowly, accepting it in a way she might not have before. The first hint of morning began to touch the edges of the world outside, barely noticeable through the hospital windows, but present enough to signal that the night was nearing its end. And Emily glanced toward it briefly before returning her focus to the twins, her thoughts moving forward now, beyond the immediate, beyond the fear, into something quieter, something that carried possibility rather than uncertainty. She turned to Alexander again, her expression softer now, more open, as if the events of the night had changed the way she saw not just the situation but him as well, and she hesitated for just a second before speaking. "I do not know what this means yet," she said, her voice calm but honest, "but I know it matters." He held her gaze, the words settling between them with a quiet weight, and for a moment, the world beyond the room seemed to fade again, leaving just the two of them, the steady breathing of the twins, and the understanding that something had begun here that neither of them had planned, something that could not be undone by the morning light. "Then we will figure it out," he said finally, his voice steady, not promising more than he could give, but not stepping away either. And Emily nodded, a small, genuine expression of acceptance crossing her face as she turned back to the twins, her hand resting lightly against the blanket once more, the quiet rhythm of their breathing now something she could trust, something she could hold on to. And as the night gave way to morning, she realized that this was no longer just a moment of survival. It was the beginning of something she had not expected, something that had found her in the most unlikely way and refused to let go. Morning arrived slowly, not in a sudden burst of light, but in a gradual softening of shadows, the pale glow filtering through the hospital windows and settling gently across the room, touching the edges of everything with a quiet reassurance that the night had passed, that what had felt endless had, in fact, come to an end, and Emily noticed it without fully turning toward it, her awareness shifting naturally as her body adjusted to the change, her mind still anchored to the steady rhythm of the twins' breathing, to the quiet rise and fall that now felt like the most important sound in the world. She had not slept, not really, though at some point she had leaned back in the chair, her eyes closing for a few minutes at a time, her body surrendering just enough to rest without fully letting go, and each time she opened her eyes, the first thing she did was look at them, confirming again and again that they were still there, still stable, still improving in small, steady ways that built a kind of quiet confidence she had not dared to feel before. Olivia's face looked calmer now, the tension gone from her tiny features, her breathing even and unhurried, and Noah, though still more delicate, showed the same steady pattern, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that no longer made Emily hold her breath in fear, and she reached out again, her fingers brushing lightly against the blanket as if she needed that physical connection to remind herself that this was real, that this was not something that would disappear the moment she blinked. Across the room, Alexander remained. Though his posture had shifted slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing as the urgency of the night gave way to something quieter, something more reflective, and he stood near the window now, the early light catching the outline of his figure as he looked out briefly before turning his attention back to the room. His presence still steady, still deliberate, but carrying a different kind of weight now, one that was no longer defined by action but by choice, by the decision to remain even when there was nothing left to fix. Emily noticed that, the subtle shift, the way he had not left when he easily could have, and it settled into her thoughts in a way that made her pause, her gaze lingering on him for a moment. Longer than before, not with uncertainty, but with a quiet curiosity that had grown through the night, shaped by everything that had happened and everything that had not yet been said. "You stayed," she said softly, the words simple but carrying more meaning than they appeared, and he looked at her, his expression calm but attentive, as if he had been expecting that observation at some point. "So did you," he replied, his tone even, not deflecting but acknowledging the shared experience in a way that made the moment feel balanced, as if what had happened was not something one of them had done for the other, but something they had both moved through together. Emily let out a small breath, her lips curving slightly, not quite a smile but something close to it, and she nodded, accepting that in a way that felt right, because it was true. She had stayed, she had not given up, even when it had felt like she might, and that realization settled into her with a quiet strength she had not fully recognized before. A nurse entered then, her movements gentle as she checked the monitors again, offering a brief update that everything continued to look good, that the twins were responding as expected, and Emily listened carefully, nodding, her focus sharp but no longer driven by fear, instead guided by understanding, by the knowledge that they were now in a place where things were being handled, where she did not have to guess or hope blindly. When the nurse left, the room returned to its quiet rhythm, and Emily shifted slightly in her chair, her body more relaxed now, her hands resting loosely in her lap, before she lifted one again to touch the edge of Noah's blanket. The motion almost instinctive, almost grounding, and she found herself thinking back to the moment everything had changed, the message, the hesitation, the decision to send it anyway. And she shook her head slightly, still not fully believing how something so small had led to this, to a hospital room filled with quiet reassurance instead of fear. "I keep thinking about that message," she said after a moment, her voice thoughtful, not directed at anyone in particular, but still reaching him, because he was there, because he understood the context in a way no one else could, and he stepped a little closer, not interrupting, just listening, his attention steady in a way that had become familiar. "If I had not sent it," she continued, her words trailing slightly as she considered the alternative, the version of the night that might have unfolded instead, and she did not finish the sentence, because she did not need to, the implication clear enough in the space between them. "But you did," he said quietly, his voice grounding the moment again, pulling it back from what could have been into what was, and she nodded slowly, her gaze returning to the twins, to the steady signs of recovery that now filled the room. "And you answered," she added, her tone softer now, carrying both gratitude and something else, something that was beginning to take shape as understanding rather than confusion. He did not respond immediately, his gaze moving briefly to the twins, then back to her, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but more open than before. "Not everything needs a reason in advance," he said, the words simple but carrying a depth that suggested they came from experience, from something he had learned rather than something he had always known. Emily considered that, her head tilting slightly as she absorbed it, and for a moment, she did not reply, because she did not need to, the meaning settling into her in its own time, and as she sat there, the early morning light growing stronger, the steady breathing of the twins filling the space with quiet reassurance, she realized that this was no longer just about what had happened during the night. It was about what came after, about the choices that would follow, the connections that had been formed without intention but with undeniable impact. And as she glanced once more toward Alexander, still present, still choosing to remain, she understood that whatever this was, it was not something that would simply fade with the daylight. It was something that would continue, something that had already begun to shape a path neither of them had planned, but both had stepped onto without turning back. The morning settled more firmly into the room, the light no longer tentative but steady, filling every corner with a clarity that made everything feel more real, more grounded, and Emily noticed how different it felt compared to the night, how the fear that had once occupied every part of her thoughts had now been replaced by something quieter, something steadier, a sense of presence that allowed her to simply be there without the constant pull of panic. And she adjusted slightly in her chair, her body finally beginning to acknowledge the exhaustion that had been waiting beneath the surface, her shoulders lowering, her breathing even, her hand still resting near the twins as if it had found its place there and did not intend to move. Olivia stirred again, her small movements gentle, almost curious, and Emily leaned in with a soft smile, her voice low as she spoke to her, the words simple but filled with warmth. "You are doing so well." And though Olivia could not understand the meaning, there was something in the tone that seemed to settle her further, her tiny fingers curling again beneath the blanket in a way that felt almost like a response. Noah followed with a quieter shift, his breathing still delicate but consistent, and Emily watched him closely, her eyes tracing the steady rhythm that now felt like reassurance instead of uncertainty, and she exhaled slowly, allowing herself to trust it, to believe that they had crossed the most difficult part, that what remained was care, patience, and time. The door opened softly, and a doctor stepped in, his presence calm and composed, carrying a tablet in one hand as he approached, and Emily straightened slightly, her attention sharpening not with fear, but with focus, ready to listen, ready to understand. And he offered a small, reassuring smile before speaking, explaining that the twins had responded well overnight, that their vitals were stabilizing, that with continued monitoring and treatment, they were expected to recover fully, and each word settled into Emily's chest with a quiet certainty, building something stronger than hope, something that felt like belief. "They will need to stay for observation for a few days," he continued, his tone steady. "But there is no immediate concern," and Emily nodded, her eyes softening as she absorbed that, because a few days felt manageable, a few days felt like something she could hold, something she could plan around, and she glanced down at the twins again, her expression gentler now, more at ease, as if she could finally see beyond the moment into what came next. When the doctor left, the room returned to its quiet rhythm, and Emily leaned back slightly, her body allowing a small moment of rest, her head tilting just enough to ease the tension in her neck, and she closed her eyes briefly, not to sleep but to feel, to let the reality settle fully, to acknowledge that they were safe, that she had made it through something she had not believed she could face alone. "You should eat something." Alexander's voice came from nearby, calm and measured, and she opened her eyes, turning her head slightly to look at him, noticing the way he remained composed even now, his attention still anchored to the situation, though no longer urgent, and she shook her head lightly, a faint smile touching her lips. "I do not think I could right now," she replied, her tone gentle but honest, because her body had not yet caught up with the idea of normal needs, of hunger, of rest, and he nodded once, accepting that without pressing further, though something in his expression suggested he would not leave it entirely unaddressed. A nurse entered again, this time carrying a small tray, placing it quietly on a nearby table, offering a few simple options, water, tea, something light, and Emily glanced at it, hesitating for just a moment before reaching for the glass of water, her hand steady now as she took a small sip, the coolness grounding her further, reminding her that she was still here too, that she needed to remain present not just for the twins, but for herself as well. "Thank you," she said softly, more to the room than to anyone in particular, but the words carried weight, gratitude not just for the water, but for everything that had brought her to this point. And she glanced toward Alexander again, her gaze holding his for a moment longer than before, because now there was something else. There, something that had grown through the night and into the morning, something that was no longer just about what he had done, but about what it meant. "I was not expecting any of this," she admitted quietly, her voice thoughtful, not overwhelmed but reflective, and he met her gaze, his expression steady. "Neither was I," he replied, and there was no hesitation in that answer, no attempt to shape it into something more convenient. Just honesty, simple and clear. Emily let out a small breath, her eyes drifting back to the twins, to the steady rhythm that now defined the room, and she considered that, the unexpected nature of everything that had happened, the way a single message had shifted the course of the night, the way a stranger had stepped into her life and remained, and she felt it then, more clearly than before, that this was not something that could be easily explained or easily dismissed. It was something that carried weight, something that would continue to unfold in ways she could not yet predict. "I do not know what happens after this," she said softly, the words not filled with worry but with curiosity, with openness. And he took a moment before responding, his gaze moving briefly to the twins, then back to her. "Then we take it one step at a time," he said, his voice calm, grounded, not offering more than what was certain, but not stepping away from it either. And Emily nodded slowly, accepting that in a way that felt right, because it matched the way the night had unfolded, one step at a time, one decision leading to the next, without needing to see the entire path ahead. She shifted slightly in her chair, her hand returning to rest near Noah, her fingers brushing lightly against the blanket, and she looked at them both again, really looking, taking in the details she had almost missed in the urgency of the night, the softness of their features, the quiet strength in their small movements, and she smiled. A real, steady smile that did not fade quickly, because it was rooted in something deeper than relief, something that had grown from everything they had just been through. And as she sat there, the morning fully present now, the hospital calm and steady around her, she realized that this moment was not just an ending to a difficult night. It was the beginning of something else entirely, something that had arrived unexpectedly but felt impossible to ignore, something that would continue beyond these walls, beyond this day, into a future that was no longer defined by what she feared, but by what she had just experienced. And as she glanced once more toward Alexander, still there, still present, she understood that whatever came next, it would not be something she faced alone again. The day unfolded slowly around them, no longer defined by urgency, but by a quiet, steady rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar after everything they had just lived through. And Emily remained seated beside the twins, her posture relaxed in a way it had not been in a long time, her hand resting lightly near them, not out of fear anymore, but out of habit, out of connection, and she watched as Olivia shifted again, her small eyes fluttering open for a brief second before closing once more, a soft, contented movement that brought a gentle smile to Emily's face, because it was normal, it was simple, it was exactly what she had been hoping for without daring to say it aloud. Noah followed with a slower stir, his breathing still delicate but consistent, and Emily leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke softly, not because he could fully understand, but because the act itself mattered, because it grounded her in the present, in the reality that they were here, that they were safe, and that this moment, this calm, was something real she could finally hold on to. The room carried a sense of quiet completion, not an ending, but a pause, a space where everything that had been uncertain had settled just enough to allow something new to begin. And Emily felt it in the way her thoughts moved now, no longer circling around fear or doubt, but opening, considering what came next in a way that felt both unfamiliar and quietly hopeful. Across the room, Alexander remained near the window, though he had moved closer earlier, his presence still steady, still deliberate, but now softer, less defined by the urgency that had brought him here and more by the choice to stay, and Emily noticed that again. The consistency of it, the way he had not treated this as something temporary, something to complete and leave behind, but something to remain part of, and she found herself studying him for a moment longer, not with uncertainty, but with a growing clarity about what this meant, about what it might become. "They are going to remember this," she said softly, her voice thoughtful as she looked at the twins, her fingers brushing lightly against the blanket. And though they were too young to understand, too young to hold memories in the way older children might, the statement carried a deeper meaning, one that reached beyond the literal, and Alexander turned slightly, his attention shifting fully to her as he considered the words. Maybe not the details, he replied quietly, stepping a little closer, his tone calm but reflective. But they will feel it. And Emily nodded slowly, because that made sense, because some things did not need to be remembered in order to matter. Some things became part of who you were without ever needing to be explained. She leaned back slightly, her body more at ease now, her thoughts clearer, and she glanced toward him again, her expression open in a way it had not been before, because the uncertainty that had once filled the space between them had shifted into something steadier, something that did not require immediate answers, but allowed for them to exist in the same space, without tension. "What happens when they are ready to leave?" she asked after a moment, the question simple on the surface but carrying layers beneath it, not just about the hospital, but about everything beyond it, the return to her life, the small apartment, the routines she had built out of necessity, and how this moment, this unexpected connection, fit into that. Alexander paused, his gaze moving briefly to the twins before returning to her, and there was a quiet consideration in his expression, not hesitation, but thought, as if he was choosing his words carefully, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that what he said now would matter. "Then we make sure you have what you need," he said, his voice steady, grounded, and Emily tilted her head slightly, her eyes searching his, because the words were simple, but the meaning behind them felt larger, less defined. "We," she repeated softly, not challenging, just clarifying, and he met her gaze without looking away, his expression calm, certain in a way that did not feel forced. "If you want that," he added, leaving the choice with her, not assuming, not taking more than what was given. And that, more than anything else, settled something inside her, because it was not about control, it was not about obligation, it was about presence, about offering without demanding, and she felt the weight of that in a way she had not expected. Emily looked down at the twins again, her fingers brushing lightly against the blanket, her thoughts moving quietly, considering, not rushed, not pressured, just open, and she let out a small breath, her shoulders easing as she allowed herself to step into that possibility, into something that had not been part of her world before, but now stood in front of her, real and undeniable. "I think I do," she said finally, her voice soft but certain, and when she looked up at him again, there was something different in her expression, something steadier, something that carried trust not built over time, but formed in a moment where actions had spoken louder than anything else. He nodded once, a small, genuine acknowledgement, and the simplicity of it felt right, because this was not something that needed to be complicated, not something that required promises or declarations, just a shared understanding that something had begun here, something that would continue in whatever form it needed to take. The room remained quiet, the steady rhythm of the monitors continuing in the background, the soft morning light now fully present, and Emily leaned slightly closer to the twins, her hand resting gently near them as she watched their breathing, her expression calm, her thoughts no longer weighed down by uncertainty, but lifted by something